Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 31st, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. So, who are we talking to today? Ooh, you guys are really going to love this one. So I had the opportunity to sit down with a renowned neuroscientist, and really he is an international authority on brain development, neuron-glia interactions, and the cellular mechanisms of memory. But the book that he recently wrote is all about brainwaves. So his name is Dr. R. Douglas Fields, and his newest book is called Electric Brain: How the New Science of Brainwaves reads minds, tells us how we learn, and helps us change for the better. Without any further ado, here he is, Dr. R. Douglas Fields. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be on your program.
I am really excited to talk about your newest book, Electric Brain: How the New Science of Brainwaves Reads Minds, Tells Us How We Learn, and Helps Us Change for the Better. So when we talk about the brain, it's pretty complicated organ. And obviously there are a lot of different levels and a lot of different kind of types of investigations and interrogations. You've got some systems level stuff, some network level stuff, some cellular, even, neurochemical, kind of what's happening within the cells. We're going to be talking a little bit about brainwaves, which is an area of research I'm actually not that familiar with. I feel like I remember what I learned in school about wakefulness and sleep and being tired and, what's happening during REM. But beyond that, I've never been involved in any brainwave research, and I haven't really read that many papers on the subject either.
Well, Cara, that's why I wrote the book. You're absolutely right. Brainwaves aren't covered in most neuroscience textbooks. And that was a mystery to me. And there's also a fascinating backstory, interplay between science and scientists in the discovery and the history of brainwaves. But that's why I wrote the book. And one of the things that's most interesting right now is that there is tremendous controversy about brainwaves among scientists. This has cleaved neuroscientists into two camps: some who believe brainwaves explain the most sophisticated aspects of how the brain works and accomplishes the amazing things that brain can do, higher level cognitive function. Other scientists say brain waves are just noise. They don't do anything. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I want to share with readers how we as scientists go about finding the truth in controversy. Secondly, there information that is out for the general public, I'm sorry to say, is very superficial. A lot of it's hyped, sensational, inaccurate. And so this is unfamiliar information, and there's not a good source of information. So that's one of the things I wanted to accomplish. But fundamentally, you're right. I think we're at a revolution now. You talked about different levels of brain operation, but we're at a revolution that's going to transform medicine and change society because the electrical activity of the brain can be detected by many different ways and give insight to neurological and psychiatric illnesses and actually tell what type of brain you have, what are your strengths, what are your cognitive weaknesses, and this sort of thing. So this is going to entirely change neuroscience, neurology, and psychiatry, I think. So it's very exciting. The ability to directly interface through electrical activity with brain function, interrogate the brain directly, and to manipulate brain function by using electrical stimulation.
It is exciting because it's also a lot less invasive, actually sometimes not at all invasive compared to some traditional means of both, like you said, interrogating, so means of collecting data, but also means of manipulating, whether it's experimental or kind of clinical, right? Whether it's a therapeutic purpose. There are a lot of really interesting ways that we can change the way that the brain is acting just based on things that we can do outside of the skull, which is very, very exciting because it's, when we talk about the brain and any changes to the brain, whether they be pharmaceutical, whether they be surgical, or other types of neurological treatments, I think it's a scary a prospect for a lot of people. That's who I am. My brain is who I am, and I don't want you to open it up. And, there's a huge risk of infection, and there's a lot that could potentially go wrong. And so the idea that there are ways to understand it and influence it that don't involve that kind of breach, I think is very exciting for a lot of people.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are many ways to monitor electrical activity in the brain that are non-invasive. And at the same time, there are many ways to control electrical activity in the brain, and with great precision. And I talk about these all in the book, both for research and for therapy or just improving cognition. So some of the ways that we can monitor electrical activity is, of course, by putting an electrode in the brain and sensing the electrical impulses that are detected, that are generated by neurons. That's a sharp electrode. That method is very, very precise, gives us a lot of information, but as you said, you have to open a person's skull or animal skull for experimental research. And that's very dangerous and very invasive. And you don't want to do that unless there's a important reason. There are many, I'm sure your listeners are well aware of Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, spending millions of dollars on developing new brain-computer interfaces. So there are many new techniques coming along. But electrical activity in the brain can be detected non-invasively in many ways. So let's begin with EEG. I think people are familiar with EEG in terms of seizure and epilepsy. And what this is when you have populations of neurons in the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain, firing as they carry out information and cognitive function. Their combined electrical activity creates electrical fields that will propagate out of the skull, and you can pick them up by an electrode placed on the scalp. And I'm sure your readers know you can put these electrodes, many electrodes, all over the brain and then pick up different signals. The analogy that you usually hear is this is like an applause meter. If you go to a baseball stadium, you could hear the roar of the stadium. You could determine a lot about what's going on in the field. There's a home run been hit or something, but you can't hear the conversations of the individual spectators. And so that's what brainwaves are. So there are other ways. There are optical methods called near-infrared spectroscopy. There's functional MRI to detect electrical activity in the brain. And then many different ways to analyze it. On the other side, we can now manipulate brainwaves very specifically. And this is very important in treating psychiatric illnesses. For example, the techniques we have now are just too blunt. We have electroconvulsive shock that just causes a seizure and somehow the brain resets itself. Very effective for treating depression, but it doesn't work for everyone. And it just makes a lot more sense to go in there and stimulate the specific circuit. And that's what's going to happen. And if you use drugs, you saturate the brain with a drug that affects synaptic transmission, but that same drug affects every cell in the body that has a sensitivity to it. So there's a real need for improved methods to specifically regulate circuits that are malfunction. But there's also ways, you can use transcranial stimulation. These are some, I can explain what they are, or direct stimulation. You can buy these devices. You can even make one, a do-it-yourself kind of device with 9-volt batteries if you want to be a guinea pig on your own brain. But you can also manipulate brainwaves by neural feedback and by sensory stimulation. And in Electric Brain, I experienced neural feedback, and I describe what it's like. I had never experienced it before, but your brain can actually change its brainwaves if given a feedback about what's happening, and it's all automatic. And so I visited some practitioners who are treating people with all kinds of complaints by using neural feedback. But even rhythmic stimulation, there's new research out of MIT showing that rhythmic lights flashing, or even rhythmic sounds at the gamma frequency. Gamma frequency is just one of the frequency bands of a brainwave, can clear beta amyloid out of a mouse brain and improve cognition. And so here we have a completely non-invasive method, drug-free method. So this is the exciting part of brainwaves. We're beginning to interact with the brain through the mechanism, the type of energy, and the process, electrical activity that it uses to operate.
I mean, there's so much obviously to unpack, which is why, of course, you wrote an entire book about it. And even your book probably can't possibly contain everything that there is to know. But I think maybe one thing that we can do now that we have a top line is to take a step back and talk about the waves themselves. You know, how are they categorized? What are the different waves that the brain puts off? And when we talk about a brain wave, what is actually happening to create that? You know, this is not magic. This is not some sort of wooey kind of term to describe something ineffable. There's actually an electrical, a detectable electrical signal that's happening in the brain. So where does it come from? How do we detect it? And what are the different categories, I guess I could ask, of brain waves?
You're absolutely right. I need to unpack that because you're asking a lot of really great questions. And because there's so little information available to the general public, there is a lot of ground to cover. So let me just say the outline of my book, my approach, and then I will describe, answer your question about what brainwaves are. But the electric brain is written in three parts. The reason is I was fascinated by what you mentioned when you started. How come we don't know the name of the person who discovered brainwaves? Why wasn't there a Nobel Prize for this? This is the most exciting discovery in electrophysiology in the last 100 years, and the name is not in textbook. Who was he? How did he do it? What did he think he discovered, and what did other scientists think about it? How did they react? So there's an interesting backstory. So in part one, it's about the discovery of brainwaves, because this was not known. I didn't know it. And you're a journalist, and you just as same as a scientist, to get answers, you have to go get primary data. So I went to the laboratories of these pioneering investigators who discovered brainwaves, and we can talk about that later. And I hope we'll talk about that, and I'll explain more. But part one of the book is about this history. How did we discover that brain works with electrical activity, and these other questions I mentioned about brainwaves. Part two of the book is understanding brainwaves, and this goes directly to your question. Now that we know how brainwaves were discovered, well, what are they, and what are they doing? And here is where I use a kind of change treatments, and I go to a first-person narrative reporting, and I visit my colleagues all around the world, because I mentioned there is this controversy about brainwaves being fundamental, and others dismissing them, and so I do this first-person reporting where I go into laboratories of colleagues around the world, listen to their data, share their experiments, and people are studying consciousness, sleep, and learning and memory, various aspects, and let the reader decide. So and I then explain what brainwaves are. Regardless of where you stand on whether brainwaves are functional or fumes, part three is about the fact that no one questions the importance of brains in manipulating and diagnosing brain function. That's what we were talking about before. So part three then is more, I still use first-person narrative, but it's also instructional. And there we talk about, brain-computer interface and prosthetic devices and how to use stimulation to improve cognition and treat diseases. So there are these three things. So your question relates to part two of the book on understanding brainwaves. So everyone knows neurons operate using electrical activity.
Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of going a little out of order. So
no, there's no order. I just wanted to explain your question about how I distilled this field into a book. So to explain what brainwaves are, neurons operate by generating electrical impulses. When enough of those neurons fire together in populations, this generates a field that can be picked up that is propagated through brain tissue and can even be picked up on the scalp. You can also pick up this with electrodes in the brain or on the brain. The interesting thing about this is that this combined electrical activity is rhythmic. And that was surprising. There's no reason to think that it should be rhythmic. Brainwaves look much like a stock market chart. And what you have with a stock market chart is you've got these day traders with these rapid oscillations, or even the minute to minute, second to second oscillations, on top of quarterly and annual and long-term waves of activity in stock market prices. That's what we find in the brain. And so the very simple way to begin to analyze this oscillating activity is just to break down this signal into its component frequencies. And that's what people have heard the terminology of alpha waves, for example. That's just the oscillations in brainwaves that occur at a frequency of about 8 to 12 cycles per second. Now, of course, there are different kinds of cognitive events and features that are associated with these different frequencies of brainwaves, but it's a mistake to think that different waves of brainwaves do something specific, like alpha waves create creativity or something. That's a misunderstanding. So we have very slow brain waves that are less than 1 per second, more like a heartbeat. Theta waves, which are 3 to 8 hertz. Beta waves that are 12 to 27 hertz, a little faster. And then gamma waves that are oscillating at the frequency of an electrical current in our light circuit, which is about 60 hertz in the United States. These can oscillate up to 100 hertz. So you have all of these different oscillations going on in the brain, and analyzing these different waves, their power, how they change with stimulation and cognition, and also how they're coordinated across different parts of the brain. Are these waves in synchrony? Are they not in phase? Or do they propagate? All of these things have important aspects. And let me just touch, if I could, on that. The reason some people think that brain waves are so fundamental to how the brain works at its most sophisticated level has to do with the features of waves that we know from everyday life, every other kind of wave. Waves interact. And in this way, you can sort and filter information. So you can have different parts of the brain who are firing in a rhythmic pattern. And if they come into phase, then they become coupled. Functionally coupled, because the important thing to understand is that at the peak of a brainwave, electrical activity in the neuron is suppressed, and at the trough, it's excited. So we have a way now to couple together functions in different parts of the brain, not by wiring and direct sending signals back and forth, but through a more sophisticated mechanism of combining activity in neurons because of wave-like properties, the destruction and the interference, all the properties of waves that people are familiar with. So that's the excitement. To give a specific example, you walk into Starbucks and you may not recognize the person being served, and then it'll take you a minute and you realize that person's in your office. And it's because part of memory involves location and context. Well, that information is not in the information about this person is in a different part of the brain than the part of the brain that controls mapping of your space. So you have to have some way to pull together information from your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus, two parts of the brain that carry out these different functions. And it's thought that these specific waves of activity are what will couple together those events and give us a coherent memory. I mean, a memory has all these features of sights and sounds and smells and sequence and all of the emotions. All of these things involve different parts of the brain. Somehow that all comes together in a memory. That's why people are excited about brainwaves.
Right. So when we think about the brain at a slightly more micro level, we're seeing these individual neurons, these individual cells, and they're firing all the time, and they're releasing different chemical substances all the time and communicating really locally, just across single synapses. But of course, there is a little bit of a more coordinated activity within kind of local regions. So, neurons are firing together when they are excited about something or when they're responding to something, when there's an input. And sometimes, like you mentioned, this happens across a pretty big distance in your brain. And so, I mean, traditionally, I think a lot of people who have studied this, at least, I don't know if it's common knowledge, are pretty aware of the idea that there are these long connections, right? These axons that can connect different regions of the brain at a network level. And so we often think of these kinds of larger thought patterns, I guess you could say, or cognitions, or even things that are sub kind of conscious, these activities, as occurring as a function of even neurons that are far away firing together because they're communicating synaptically. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there are also these kind of waves that arise that you can measure even outside of the cell, which is sort of a function of collective electrical activity that can actually synchronize different regions of the brain so that they functionally work together.
That's right. A good way to think about it are boats in a harbor. Waves, and will synchronize all the boats in a harbor. Well, if those boats are neurons and the waves are changes in voltage, and voltage is how neurons communicate, then you're going to couple together electrical activity in different parts of the brain. But here's the rub. We see waves everywhere in nature. They just occur, waves and created by wind in a wheat field. How, at a scientific level, do you prove what we've just said we think is true, that this is coordinating information in the brain? How do you prove it? So that's what I like to share with people in part 2, is how scientists are going about trying to prove it. And the problem is, so much of the data we have are correlations. We can change. We can see differences in cognitive events associated with brain waves, but we haven't come up, and that's a correlation, and everyone knows correlation doesn't mean causation. So that's kind of the difficulty right now.
Gotcha. So it's hard to know if you notice that there's a certain detectable brainwave, and then you notice that there's a certain function, a certain, like, whether it's a cognitive function or a sensory or a motor function. You can say, okay, those two things are correlated, but you don't know if the brainwave is causing the function or the function is actually causing the brainwave, or that there's some sort of intermediary involved.
That's the problem. And I didn't write the book to argue my position, although I wouldn't have written it if I didn't think it was an important subject. And there are a lot of good experiments, but it indicating that they're functional. But this is a controversy, and it's very interesting to see how science sorts out controversy, trying to find the truth.
Right. So, I mean, I think the obvious next question, just based on what we were saying, was the idea not just of measuring function and activity in a sort of active brain that we're not manipulating, but wouldn't a way that science could investigate this further be, and obviously the answer is yes, but to interrogate the brain, to actually use some sort of device that induces a change in a brainwave or knocks out a brainwave, for example, and then to see what happens behaviorally.
Yep. And that's what we need here are better techniques. Those experiments are done. The problem is that it gets down to neural coding. How is information coded in the nervous system? And if you do something that changes a frequency of a brainwave or blocks a brainwave, you've probably also changed other aspects of neural coding. Anyway, we're getting a little into the weeds here, I think, but new techniques are trying to do that right now, allow us to more specifically control how brainwaves function. But I think this ability to monitor brainwaves is fascinating. It's going to change society. You can record brainwaves for 5 minutes and know what kind of brain you have. You can measure IQ. You can know what your strengths and weaknesses are. I visited investigator Chantel Pratt in Washington University, Seattle, and she claimed that she could record my brainwaves for 5 minutes as I did nothing. No tests, no task, just record my brainwaves while I let it wander and tell whether or not I would have an easy or a hard time learning a foreign language. So I challenged her to do that. And just by the power of frequency of brainwaves in one part of the brain, she can predict that. Fascinating. And this works because everyone's brain's different, but the brain works, as you said, as a network. So when you're mind has nothing to do. There are certain networks of internal activity that are more or less specific to your brain and can give insight into how your individual brain works. Another example, you can measure, researchers are measuring brain activity in a preschool child's brain, listening to words and nonsense words, and based on that result, can predict how well that child will be able to learn to read when she goes to school. So, how is this going to change career choices and education? Are people? We don't like to think that people are going to be tracked based on innate cognitive abilities, and we also like to think that our success in life is determined by effort and not predetermined. But actually, the truth is somewhere between the two. That's what's, I think, very fascinating and relevant to almost everyone.
So I've got to say that kind of like my skeptical brainwaves are tingling a little bit. I mean, you did mention early on the idea of sort of like pop psychology and pop neuroscience and the sort of superficial level that I think we often are fed this kind of information in the media, the hype of like, a promise of treatments or investigations that are maybe a little bit beyond reach. And I've got to say, those sound like pretty spectacular claims. The idea that just reading a wave and a frequency or a pattern of that wave can tell somebody so many, I guess, what I would consider to be very plastic things.
Well, yes, and that's why I use the approach I use. By the way, there are probably 300 references to the scientific literature in the book, but also I describe in detail the experiments and in many cases participate in them because the information is not portrayed accurately, and there is so much hype. One of the problems is you can buy brainwave measuring gadgets, so anybody can, become a practitioner, I guess, or use the device. That's kind of a problem. You can't just modulate brain function by getting your hands on SSRIs, but that's kind of a problem. But I'm talking about scientific research. So I take people into the labs. Howard Poisner in UC San Diego was interested in how the brain learns its location, because the way we're taught in school that you learn is by punishment reward. That's not how we learn complex information. You learn your way around your environment by interacting with the environment. So he put virtual goggles on me, creates an artificial environment, and I go through this environment. And I wish I could tell you more, but we have so much to talk about. And he can see by brainwaves activity my brain learning the environment. I visited Marcel Just's lab at Carnegie. He can use functional MRI to determine what a person's thinking. He can determine whether you're thinking of a number between 1 and 7. They can know what you're reading, and even predict what you're going to do, because he did a study on suicidal ideation. Suicide's is often a shock because people who are desperate and in agony hide their thoughts of suicide, and even their close family, even their therapist may not know they're contemplating suicide. Marcel Just can tell by looking at their brain activity very reliably if this person is suicidal. That is very, very powerful, important, life-saving. But it does raise this ethical issue because he does this by presenting different words like death and happiness, and seeing how an individual's brain reacts differently to those words from the normal, so-called average population response. All right. So it works, but at what point do we say that because this person's brain is not average, responding in an average way, do we incarcerate him or intervene, I guess I should say. But this is, my book is science.
Right. It's about the interpretation of that data for sure.
But this is science-based, and it's all from the primary scientific literature. Some of it from going to neuroscience meetings and other kinds of meetings. So some of this isn't yet published, but it's I know it's surprising. And some other things that are surprising are that you can transmit information from mind to mind. And that's also true.
Interesting. Yeah, let's talk about that idea of kind of like a newer sort of neuroscientific concept of telepathy, because I know it sounds like hokum, but there are some, I think a lot of that is just because of how the media packages it, and using terms like telepathy, I think kind of throws people off. But what's actually happening there?
Well, it is a very primitive method. You're absolutely right. We're nowhere near being able to understand. We don't know how the brain processes information at a detailed level enough to read it like a computer code. So when information is transmitted from brain to brain, what's happening is a brainwave response can be detected. Sort of like listening to the engine RPM and knowing when to push on the clutch. And use that to trigger a signal. It can be a signal controlling a prosthetic device, or you could send that signal over the internet and then use a stimulation through the brain, a magnetic pulse through the brain, to compel the recipient to do something, to have a motor action, to move a hand. So you can have a video game played directly between two brains in different locations by using this method. But you're right. The person who first discovered human brainwaves, and we haven't talked about it, I'll tell you now. His name is Hans Berger in Jena, Germany, and he did his experiments on mental patients in the turn of the 20th century, and he did them all in secret, and he told no one what he was doing. And one of the things that he was very interested in is mental telepathy. He believed in mental telepathy. And I explain a passage where he thinks he experienced mental telepathy. So there, you have, anytime you have new science, you've always got these cross currents of what's known, what's not known, murky, what's clear, science and pseudoscience. And so that's all going on at the same time.
Oh, wow. Let's dig a little bit more into this discovery and like how it came to be, and kind of what the general, response was to the early publications.
Right. So in order to do that, human brainwaves were first discovered by Hans Berger, and he worked in Jena, Germany, former East Germany, in a mental hospital. He eventually became the director of that hospital. And he did his work in secret on patients and members of his family. He told nobody what he was doing. He first recorded human brainwaves in 1924, and he kept it a secret for 5 years before revealing it. What did he think? What was he doing? Well, he was interested in the interaction between the physical and the mental. He believed that psychic energy, which is cognition, is different from physical energy, but they're both forms of energy. So according to the laws of thermodynamics, you can't create energy or destroy it. So it has to be converted from one form to the other. So he began his experiments looking for conversions of physical responses in the brain. And one of the first was he would hook up to a brain, a person's head, something like a manometer, which is one of these air pressure and fluid goes up and down in a U-shaped tube. What he did is he put that device on his patients who had a cranial defect. Had some injury, so that part of the skull was missing. It had grown over, but he put this device on this cranial defect and recorded the brain's pulsing. Now, it was pulsing in response to blood pressure, but then he had them do cognitive tasks, and he had emotional responses. He stimulated them with different smells and tried to, it seems maybe a little silly, but he's trying to find this connection between blood flow, physical actions in the brain, and cognition, which of course functional MRI, those pictures we see of how we can determine where in the brain some electrical activity and processing is taking place, that works by detecting blood flow. So he's sort of on the right track. Another approach he used was thinking that, anytime you have energy, there's work, it's always accompanied by a change in temperature. So he stuck rectal thermometers into his patient's brains. And, I don't know if they thought they were getting a treatment or whatever. Obviously, these are terrible human experiments, but it was at a time when such things unfortunately happened. And then he would try to measure changes in temperature that are associated with mental function. And then finally, we're talking, the turn of the century, and electricity is the newest kind of discovery technology. So when that came about, he then started to look for electrical events in the brain. And to his surprise, when he finally succeeded in recording electrical activity, and I realized the equipment is very, very primitive, hard to detect, he saw these waves were oscillating. And what he first found were alpha waves, these 10 hertz waves, which became to be called Berger waves. So that's the person. But how come we don't know his name? Why didn't he get a Nobel Prize? That's the interesting thing. So I went to Vienna, I went through his notebooks, I talked to colleagues. I have to abbreviate this because we're kind of running out of time. But the story was that Berger committed suicide in response to the Nazis, the rise of Nazism. And as we know, the eugenics movement all began in mental hospitals. So Berger would have been right in the middle of it. The forced sterilization and the murder, genetic cleansing, began on mental patients. And even the methods were developed in mental hospitals and then moved to concentration camps and scaled up. So he would have been in the middle of it. The story was Berger couldn't get along with the Nazis, and he committed suicide in protest. He hung himself in the hospital. Going through the notes and talking to scholars, Suzanne Zimmerman and Christoph Reddies, we learned that this is a complete whitewash. And, history is written, is written. It's not a record. And I mean, we're seeing this now as people pulling down statues and saying history is not accurate, whatever. So, in fact, the records show, due mainly to Suzanne Zimmerman's getting a hold of records from the Stasi police after the fall of the Berlin Wall, finding out that Berger was really a Nazi supporter. He was an anti-Semite. He was the head of the forced sterilization movement and on the committee that condemned alcoholics, homosexuals, mentally impaired people to forced sterilization. So he committed suicide because he had depression. That's all it was. And so do you give this kind of a person a Nobel Prize? So that's part of the aspects. It's an interesting thing about science, that science takes place on a backdrop of society. And at the same time, the work he was doing was not accepted and actually nobody paid any attention to it. People at the time were studying brain function by what you said, reductionist, looking at brain cells under a microscope, doing biochemistry, a reductionist approach, finding which part of the brain did what. And here you have some guy in Germany who says, I can just put 2 electrodes on the whole head and tell you all these things about how the brain's working. Didn't make any sense. People dismissed it entirely. It wasn't until 10 years later when a Nobel Prize winner, Edgar Adrian, in 1932, repeated the experiments. And he reported, these Berger waves exist. And he published it in a prominent journal, Brain. But in the same journal, same article, he mocked Berger by including a recording of his own Nobel Prize-winning brain waves and how they changed when he opened and closed his eyes, superimposed on the same experiment done on a water beetle's brain. So indicating that, this is sort of a trivial phenomenon or something. So that's kind of a lesson in science.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to, I think it's important when we talk about the history of science to look at science through the contextual lens of, who are the people doing it? What were their politics? When did they live? How did they live? Obviously, I think we have to really be critical anytime we come across early investigations that were pre-Nuremberg Code investigations, especially those carried out during the rise of Nazism in Germany, because of the deeply unethical methods by which a lot of these data were collected. And, obviously agenda that was often behind the types of research that were done. So, we know kind of classically, I think a lot of people listening to the show have a pretty good grasp of the scientific method. We know that there's always an attempt in science to be as bias-free as possible, but of course science is done by people, so there's always some bias involved. But when the bias is so obvious, when the idea is that it's not about hypothesis testing, but it's about trying to arrive at the result that I already know I want to arrive at because it has some sort of political justification for atrocity, you have to really take that with a grain of salt. And so I'm glad that you really kind of uncovered that whitewashing of history in your account, because I think it's incredibly important to understand who these people were, why they were doing what they were doing, and to understand that the research findings, the publications that came out of this era and out of these types of experiments are probably deeply biased and deeply flawed. The interesting thing is that there are always, not always, but sometimes these underlying understandings, like you said, that do later become replicated and that do it in a way that is more ethical. But the mention that you made of the eye-opening and closing, I mean, this is something that I experienced myself when I was doing some science journalism.
What you said was so intriguing. I agree with everything you said, except that it sounds a little bit like you're putting this in a historical context. And what my message is, the same thing's happening now. This is the process of science, and we have we do not know the truth. The answers are not in the back of the book. And so we have these same problems of separating. And then also the ethics continue to be a problem. Brain stimulation was a tremendously advanced in the 1950s. Jose Delgado was manipulating people's brains by radio-controlled transmitters. And he did this to alleviate psychiatric illness and also to eliminate from society degenerate behavior and violence. So his motives were good, but it got abused. For example, at Tulane University, experiments were done to try and cure a man of homosexuality by stimulating the part of the brain that, Robert Heath did this experiment to promote reward, actually a sexual response. To try to cure this man of homosexuality. What happened is suddenly people saw that this was clearly unethical research, and it stopped. It didn't get published in journals, didn't get supported by grants, and it stopped in 1950, early 60s. We're now coming back because some scientists think they were on the right course, on the right path. The issue of ethics is hard because people now treating people with electrical stimulation, deep brain stimulation, we don't know enough about how that works. So the surgeons are experimenting on patients. And we don't know what stimulation to use. We don't know where to put the electrode because this is different in every person's brain, and because, the stimulation, once a method is approved, deep brain stimulation is approved for Parkinson's. So, now we can use it to treat OCD or something else off-label, but it doesn't mean that the way we're doing it to treating one disorder works for the other disorder. So this experimentation is going on. I don't think it's necessarily unethical. People have to be informed that you talk to the surgeons doing this, they're doing it because it's helping their patients. It's transforming their lives when they get it right. And, the other quandary is, I mentioned ECT, electroconvulsive shock therapy. I don't have time to go into that, but how that was discovered, those experiments would never have been done today. The person caused a seizure in these people's brain with no idea about how it worked, and then used cattle prods that were used to stun pigs in a slaughterhouse, and with no real fundamental understanding. Yet it works. ECT is the most effective way to treat chronic depression in people where there's no other treatment. But in terms of how this is still happening today. That was just the tip of the iceberg of the history, because where did Berger get his idea to do this? And I trace back, I'm not going to go through everything, but the first person, he was not the first person to record brainwaves. The first person to record brainwaves did so in animals, naturally. And that was Adolf Beck. And he was a Polish scientist. Very interesting history. And again, he did this in 1891. So, what kind of equipment do you have? There are no electronic amplifiers. There's no electronics at all. So it's fascinating how these guys were working, a century ahead of their time with primitive technology and getting the right answers. So Adolf Beck did this. He found brain waves. He understood the oscillations and how they responded. But he was in Poland. Because of the war, he was taken prisoner by the Russians, put in prison in Kiev. All his research stopped. He wrote to Pavlov, the famous Russian scientist, pleading that he intervened to get him released. This is World War I. And after a couple of years, Pavlov was successful. Adolf Beck was released. He went back to work. But then World War II comes along. The German army invades. And, Beck was a Jew, and he was an intellectual, and he was Polish. And the Nazis exterminated, hundreds of thousands of such people. Adolf Beck was very much a target. And when they came to take him to a concentration camp, rather than have the Nazis take his life, Beck took his own life by swallowing cyanide. So now we have the two, we have this history interleaved with science and Nazism, and one side committing suicide for one reason, the other side committing suicide for Nazism. The last thing I have to tell you is, the most fascinating thing is that brain waves actually had been discovered 50 years before Hans Berger's work. And they were discovered before Adolf Beck's work. Yeah. So it turns out the first person to discover brainwaves was Richard Caton. And it's fascinating because near my house, which is near the Baltimore-Washington International Airport, there's a town called Catonsville. Never paid any attention to it till I started reading this history. Well, it was established in the early 1700s, even before the United States was a country, by the Catons family, and they came from England. Richard Caton was a London and a Liverpool physician, and he recorded brainwaves in 1875. Electricity flows through nothing in the man-made world in 1875, And how did he do that? It's fascinating. I go into how he actually did these measurements. He got it all right. He describes oscillations, brainwaves, and all this function. He came to the United States and he went to Georgetown University and he read his paper. And then in his notes afterward, he says, read my paper on electrical currents of the brain. It was well received, but not understood by most of the audience. Even though he put his findings in the British Medical Association journal, people didn't get it. It was too far ahead of his time. People were doing science at that time were physicians. What are you going to do? The therapeutic aspects of brainwaves were not evident. Everyone forgot about his work. And that's what I find really fascinating, because that's happening every day. Somebody's published something today that we don't get, and we won't get it for a couple of decades.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely fascinating, as you mentioned, this idea of looking things through a historical lens and context, but also understanding that history is occurring right now, and it is as written. And so there is kind of it's sort of I think, human-induced distinction between back then and now, because it's harder for us to have that hindsight bias when we're actively living it. You mentioned earlier this idea of the challenge of the brainwave research. And this is something that happened with me when I was doing some journalism on EEG. And I visited kind of like the Human Performance Lab at Red Bull, where they were doing a lot of really interesting research. And one of their neuroscientists, put me in a full EEG cap, connected all these electrodes to me, and then did the exact same thing, had me open my eyes and close my eyes, and showed me this intense difference between the oscillations, just from something as simple as sitting still or something as simple as being quite active. And I think that the argument there, and that you kind of often hear as a pushback against all the specific wonders of brainwave research is that these are very, I guess, gross or very broad generalizations of what's happening in the brain. And how can we ever expect to be so specific to certain cognitive capabilities or certain very, uh, individual functions when something as simple as opening your eyes or closing your eyes causes such a massive change in your brain's electrical activity?
Well, that change is a fact, but it's also localized to a certain part of the brain. It's primarily in the visual cortex, and it makes perfect sense. You're no longer receiving all of this information. It's sort of like two kids, some kid pushing on a wading pool and creating waves, right? And if you'll get these low frequency, big amplitude waves. Those are the alpha waves. But now if you get two or more kids coming in and pushing, what happens? You end up with all these high frequency waves. That's what happens when you open your eyes. You've suddenly opened your eyes. Your thoughts are no longer internal, and you're getting all of this activity in the brain. And now you get a different frequency of brain waves. That does not mean the alpha waves did something. It is associated and understood by this change in brainwave patterns. But there's a lot going on now in technology with brain-computer interface. I interviewed and met several people who have implants in their brain and can operate prosthetic devices. New methods like Zuckerberg and Musk to create new methods for brain-computer interface. A lot of hype in the way that is portrayed in the media. But there's also a lot to be learned about that. And to give you an example of just the problem, reading out information is one thing. I mean, we can use fMRI and we can begin to say, when the brain, we use machine learning, you can say just the same way that Amazon does, can determine what you're interested in buying just by mining the data and saying, when we see this kind of wave activity in this part of the brain, that means this person wants to move their arm. That's the level of understanding we have, but you can use that. That's all you need. Use it as a trigger for a motor and whatnot. Putting information back into the brain, creating a digital super intelligence layer, as Musk calls it, is crazy at this point. Someday maybe we'll have it, but let me give you an example of why that's crazy. First of all, we don't know in detail how the brain works. We don't know the codes, and we don't know which neuron are you going to stimulate. Even if we knew which neuron, is it the same neuron in your brain that does that function in my brain? Well, no. That's why we have people awake when we do neurosurgery, because we don't know it. Secondly, how are you going to control? Know which circuit and control that? So let's just do a simple calculation here. Instead of the millions and billions of neurons that you may need to control to do something like, download an image for, Black Mirror episode or something, that's science fiction. Let's just take 300 neurons, a circuit of 300 neurons. Now let's simplify that neuron. Any neuron can be on or off. That's a great simplification. We know there's a neural code. They have a temporal and a spike time code. So there's a code, but let's just make it simple. Of these 300 neurons, they can either be on or off. Now we're going to try and deliver information into this circuit. Well, how many combinations of those 300 neurons being on and off are there? Well, that's 2 raised to the power of 2. Yeah, 2 raised to the power of 300, which is more than all the atoms in the known universe. So, this idea of industrial scale to get more and more electrodes so we can put in high bandwidth and high frequency activity meets this challenge. And that's a simplification. If the order in which those neurons fired was important, and of course it is, you reach more than all the atoms in the known universe with only 80 neurons. It's 80 factorial. So it's, it gives you, I think, some appreciation of the complexity that goes on in the brain and the challenge to being able to control it.
Yeah, I mean, given these, massive problems, I guess you could say. I don't know if problem is quite the right word, but the massive amount of complexity, sometimes the hubris involved in people from outside of the neuroscience field trying to make great claims as to what is and isn't possible. You see this a lot with people talking about downloading our consciousness or being able to, solve problems of consciousness who it doesn't seem like they actually have done the work to dive deep into what some of these holy grails in neuroscientists or in neuroscience have long been. So given these kinds of like very complex issues, and then superimposing on that the information that you've gathered through all of your research into kind of the brainwave aspect of neuroscience and especially clinical neuroscience. What do you think the future looks like in terms of, potential treatments, in terms of mitigating or preventing disease? How long do you think it might take for some of these very real opportunities to start to materialize in a meaningful, I guess maybe I could say even personalized medicine kind of way?
It's happening right now. What we're talking about is a reality, but it's happening in experimental laboratories and will soon be released for use in medicine. So this is, that's the way it works, but it's happening now in experimental laboratories. But the ability to directly interrogate and manipulate the brain through electrical activity is going to transform medicine and do it, in electricity will do for the brain what biochemistry did for the body. You go to a doctor and first thing they do is take a blood test and then they do a biochemical analysis and they tell you what your health is. We're very soon, because this happens now already, this is just happening widely in the experimental literature. Very soon you'll go to a doctor, a neurologist, psychiatrist, and they will read your brain activity. And then they will be able to diagnose functions. And then you can do something. If the biochemistry analysis of your blood says, oh, you have high cholesterol. Well, you're at risk of a stroke. And now you can take some action. That's the same kind of thing we're going to have. It doesn't mean you're going to have a stroke, but you are now at high risk of stroke. Somebody can measure your brain waves and a certain function and say, your child is not going to be able to read easily. And you can start to intervene even before they go to school. You can say, you're prone to depression, or you have impulse disorder, high risk of impulse disorder because of this activity in the brain, because the way your neural circuits and brain waves are operating in your individual brain. That you asked how long? The answer is it's already happened. It's now. It's real, but it's in laboratories. And what people need to understand is when you do EEG in a laboratory, it's not like buying something on the internet. These are the most sophisticated instruments and scientists and mathematicians and supercomputers in order to collect and analyze and properly collect and mine and interpret this data. So it's the best. You need highly specialized scientists, a team of scientists. You need the best equipment you can get. And then you get really good data and you get very good responses. You can improve Parkinson's through neurofeedback. Pretty amazing, but it's not yet, in your doctor's office, because there has to be some technological advancement but it will be. I mean, the FDA approved transcranial magnetic stimulation for treating depression and pain, and that's just pointing the way for treatments in the future of all kinds of mental illnesses.
Well, Doug, there is so much interesting information in this book, everything from the history of the discovery of brainwaves to how, what we know now to what the future might hold. I think it's a really, really, really important primer. And it goes long, it goes much deeper than being just an introduction to this really fascinating field. It's highly recommended for the listeners to get a nice deep dive, but also an understandable deep dive into what brainwaves are and what they can tell us, and potential treatments and therapies in the future. I'm really interested, Doug. I close my episodes every week by asking my guests the same two big picture questions. And as a laboratory neuroscientist, but also as an author, as a journalist who's been, or I should say as a writer, science writer, who's been diving deep into these subjects for quite some time, I'm really interested to hear your take on these big two questions. Does that work for you?
Sure. So which big two questions?
All right. So here they come. So when you look to the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now, so obviously it could have to do with your work, with what you've been writing about lately or experimenting with. It could have to do with humanity, with something much more kind of global or even cosmic, or it could be a little more personal. Number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, maybe even, I don't know, pessimistic, cynical, like what is the thing that's not looking good? And then if you had to pick something on the flip side of that, what are you most genuinely and authentically really optimistic about and looking forward to?
I'm most interested in how the study of brainwaves is going to transform our understanding of how the brain works. And that's fascinating, at a fundamental level. I'm very interested in how this will change society, as I talk about diagnosis, but also being able to know, what your brain can do easily just by monitoring your brainwaves. Now, there are potential ethical questions there. We've talked about some in terms of tracking people in school and whatnot. But that doesn't concern me. I mean, we know this already. So there is a physical limitation on performance in your body. Well, everything is an interaction between biology and the environment. And so that doesn't concern me so much. Another interesting aspect is just how science works and how you find the truth. And it's a huge collaboration and how that interacts with society. We talked about these historical cases, but this is going on right now. If you just read the book, it's me going around the world because talking to scientists. And I don't think people realize that, like Hemingway and would go to sidewalk cafes in Paris and interact with writers all around the world. That seems so glorious. That's what scientists do, because there may only be a handful of people in the world who understand what you're doing. So you go around and you get ideas by talking to people, sharing ideas. We haven't been able to do that in COVID. There's no travel. Everything stopped. That's a specific example, but science is very fragile because it's so collaborative. You have to interact. So that's one thing. So I'm not really concerned because, it's happening. It's a fact. And we need to get used to it and learn how to use it. I'm a lot like you. I'm a scientist, but I'm also a science journalist. I member of the National Association of Science Writers and DC Science Writers, and I go to press conferences and whatnot, which is kind of bridging territories. But I do that, I think, like you, because I love science. I love doing it, reading it, talking about it, and writing about it. And also, when I do my technical writing, that's pretty dull. And it's wonderful to be able to share what I do with a different kind of writing. It's kind of liberating and more creative. And fundamentally, back to this question, science is so fragile. It's supported by society. You can't do it alone. And everything I do is supported by the public. And all they ask is to know what I discovered or other scientists discovered. So I enjoy communicating science to other people.
If you had to pick something, though, I'm going to push you on this a little bit. If you had to pick something, though, that really does worry you, I mean, something that's like, you feel like is a threat that does keep you up at night, especially within the context of what we've been talking about? Can you put your finger on something? Is it, an anti-science movement that we're seeing in our country? Is it a lack of trust in the scientific establishment? I mean, what is it that really does worry you?
Well, that's definitely a worry. That's a good way of kind of paraphrasing what my worry would be in that regard. The worries that people may have about, mind control and reading people's minds, that's not a worry to me. We're so far away. In order to know what a person is thinking, you've got to have them concentrate, on this thought, a red apple. You got to think about that red apple over and over and over. And then we can begin to get the data to understand how the brain is responding. And it's interesting because different parts of the brain respond emotionally and whatever to our concept of an apple. But all the person has to do is let their mind wander or think of a green apple instead of a red apple or a Apple computer. And we haven't got a clue. So I don't really see the risks in terms of the fears that drive, sensationalism and science fiction. And I've also seen the benefit to quadriplegics, people who've had their lives transformed. So, but I am concerned about support for science and the ability to collaborate. And just this big question that we always have as scientists of not ever knowing if we're right or not. We don't know it. And it's only after time and replication that we see where we've got it right or not. Those are the interesting things, but they're not worries. I enjoy the process.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, gosh, thank you so much for enlightening us today. I learned an awful lot. I know there's much more to be learned within the pages of your most recent book. It's called Electric Brain: How the New Science of Brainwaves Reads Minds, Tells Us How We Learn, and Helps Us Change for the Better. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, and I really appreciated the time we got to spend together today.
Well, great. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Of course. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.